Hi, hello. Welcome back to the fourth week of Psychology 3400. This week we are talking about the basic social psychological processes that are related to thinking about other people and events. Last week we talked about the building blocks of social cognition. And even though we were talking about social cognition, most of what we talked about was really just focused on individual people. And so now this week we're going to start understanding and exploring how these learned and evolved social cognitive processes relate to our interpretations of the outside world. So first, let's do a brief review of social cognition from last week. It should occur to you that the reason why I'm doing a brief review is that these concepts are important and will probably be frequently referenced or relevant to the exam that you're taking next week. And also that it's good to make them salient as we move forward through today's lecture. We're going to be referencing schemas and motives in social cognition quite a bit. So again, remember that a schema is a mental structure that contains prior knowledge and associations with a concept. Right? Our schemas are informed by our interpersonal interactions, our personal experiences, and broad cultural sources such as the media and various organizations we're associated with. Scripts are schemas that are specific to social situations, and impressions are schemas that are specific to other people. Later in this lecture, we'll talk a lot more about impression formation. As you move through this lecture, just like the last lecture, think about the motives in social cognition that we highlighted. We talked first about, well, not first, but at one point we talked about affective motivations in social cognition. Right, so we talked about the motives towards security and growth and hedonism in the past. We are motivated to feel good and to avoid negative feelings. And those affective motivations will often sort of color or contextualize how we take in and recall information about the social world. Along with that, we have the motives that we discussed under the umbrella of lay epistemics, right? So we have the need to be accurate, the need for closure, and the need to confirm, right? And so recall that the need to be accurate is something that often takes a lot of cognitive energy and is almost in direct contrast with the need for closure, right? Because there's so much information out in the world that you could always be taking in more, building towards this idea of accuracy, and at some point we all need closure. And of course, the need to confirm is the desire to take in information and mold it to the biases and beliefs that we already hold. So keep these in mind as we move through the lecture today because they're really important, and again, have them sort of propped in your mind for understanding the world at large and going into your exam next week. First, before we jump in to understanding how our social cognitive processes play out in external events, let's talk about memories because they're pretty important to the formation of schemas and vice versa. Uh, and really have just an important role in how we process and understand and navigate the world. So here, what I have for you is a pretty popular infographic on how memories are formed. You've maybe seen something like this before. It's of course a bit simplistic. Memory formation is a very complex process. And if you ever want to have some fun, you can go look at the Wikipedia page to see the utter complexity of it. However, for our purposes, what you really just need to know is that there are these stages of information processing that either lead to something being encoded in memory or lead to that information being lost. Right? So we have our sensory input from the external world, that gets held in sensory memory or is otherwise lost. And that gets transferred to short-term memory, which is information and input that is currently activated. Short-term memory is closely associated with the concept of working memory. It's often through rehearsal or other factors that we're going to discuss here in a minute that information held in short-term memory then gets transferred into long-term memory. Information that's held in our long-term memory isn't necessarily always currently activated. You probably know that intuitively, of course. And of course, when our long-term memories are activated, that brings the information back to short-term memory. Pretty straightforward, right? But what we'll find as we talk later is that that cyclical process between short-term memory and long-term memory is very important for how we understand the world. And it's not a direct process. Through that process, things continually change, which really speaks to the malleability of memory. And we'll talk more about that as this lecture progresses. So now we understand the basic progression of how external information gets encoded into one's memory. But it's also important for you guys to think about what helps long-term memories form. That infograph I showed you mentioned rehearsal, right? So information that we are commonly exposed to or that we actively work to remember is of course more likely to go into long-term memories. So if you've noticed that I try to reference past theories we've talked about, past concepts, that's me trying to get you guys to rehearse information that I think is really important for you to learn and really important for you to know for the exam. You do active rehearsal on your own when it comes to studying, when it comes to meeting someone's name, meeting someone and learning their name. So a lot of people are really bad at remembering names when they first meet someone, and maybe you've compensated for this by when you get introduced to someone and they say their name, you make sure to listen closely and you repeat it back to yourself a few times. Maybe no one else does that, but I do it, and I found that it is actually very helpful for remembering people's names. I also train as a psychotherapist, which I think I've mentioned to you all before. And so what I'll find is that in session, I will sometimes actively rehearse important things they've told me. So that way I can remember when I'm writing the note what points I should be hitting when I write the progress note for that therapy session. Information that is viewed as extremely relevant, especially to our goals, is more easily stored in long-term memory as well. So if you were presented with some news that that there are people who are more susceptible to the coronavirus, you might be kind of interested in that. And then if you hear that young people are especially susceptible to the coronavirus and you're presumably young, that's going to be more relevant to you and you're more likely to remember that information versus if you were older. It of course makes sense that we try to encode information that is relevant to our goals because as we've talked about over several lectures, we are goal striving beings who are oriented to feel safe and also to grow. And so we need whatever information that is going to help us reach our goals while maintaining our security. Finally, information that is emotionally salient or emotionally laden is going to be more easily encoded in long-term memory as well. It's pretty unlikely that you remember a lot of things that are like mundane, right? How many specific times can you remember watching TV with your friends? You probably had an enjoyable time, but it's unlikely that you felt any super strong emotions. And so all the times that you've watched television with your friends kind of get melded together. On the flip side, you might remember one particular time you were watching a TV show with your friend and something really funny or scary happened and you guys had, a really strong reaction to it. That's an example of how emotionally laden information tends to be more clearly and definitively stored in our long-term memory. Something that's important here too is for learning theories and psychopathology. So, in particular, we can think about post traumatic stress disorder and how most theories of PTSD hypothesize that traumatic experiences, which are typically very emotionally uh, laden, that these traumatic experiences, because they're so emotionally disturbing, they get encoded into one's memory in a way that makes them very distinct and triggering and difficult to re-experience. So that's one way that these basic processes and memory, which inform our social cognition, are also related to psychopathology. Now that we have a basic understanding of how memory functions, we can think about how this relates to social cognition and our navigation of the social world. This quote in your books, I think, is really, really great. I just find it really impactful. And so John Kilstrom, he said that memory is not so much like reading a book as it is like writing one from fragmentary notes. This should make sense to you all, right? We are aware of the concept of a photographic memory, and maybe you have one or you know someone who does, but it's pretty rare when you are asked to think of a given memory. Really, what you're recalling is not objective. Instead, it's a representation of the subjective aspects of the environment at that time that you felt were relevant, right? You only encoded things that seemed important or significant to you, and then you're likely to only recall things that are important and significant to you. This is really important to think about because memory is the foundation of our understanding of the world. Like I said, there is a relationship between memory and schema, and our schemas affect how we see people, how we navigate the world, how we think we should behave in different situations. So, understanding that memory is a reconstructive process is something that should be really salient to you as you navigate this information in this class. We are taking in information about the world, but we're only taking in what seems important or relevant at the time. And what's interesting about what seems important or relevant at the time is that that is informed by the existing biases we already have. Imagine, for example, that I have met him with my friend Olivia. And later, I'm on the phone with my mom, and my mom asks what it was like to hang out with Olivia. Before my meeting with Olivia, I would have gone into the situation with expectations, desires, um, existing scripts and impressions, all for that situation, right? Olivia's my friend, and so I'm expecting to do something that friends typically do together. My personal schema of friendship is usually talking about funny or interesting things, maybe gossiping about people, watching a reality show together, etc. Then I also have my impression of Olivia as a person, right? Someone who is talkative and bubbly and who loves to gossip. Going into this situation, I have an idea of what it's going to be like, which of course brings me a lot of comfort versus if I was meeting someone I didn't know very well. And so let's say I hang out with Olivia and we do gossip and we talk about our lives. And then she also talks about some difficulties she's had at her job and and maybe some obscure hobby that she has that I'm really not that interested in. Like maybe she's really into woodworking, and I think that's lame because I'm pretty scared of splinters or whatever. Later, then, when my mom asks me what it was like to hang out with Olivia, it's likely that I'm going to recall the things that fit within my existing schema of Olivia and that I found interesting. So I might spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about how Olivia and I gossiped over someone we know, and not mention at all that she talked for quite a while about her woodworking hobby. Later on, right, it might be that when I think of that particular hangout with Olivia, I don't even recall her talking about her hobby because it just never occurred to me as significant. And so this is just one example of how our memory is a reconstructive process that can lose things over time. And that even from the get-go, you really only attend to things that seem relevant or interesting or significant. I think understanding memory is pretty important for understanding how people function within themselves and out in the world. And so please watch this crash course on how we make memories. I think it's about 10 minutes. There could very well be a question on the exam about it, so you definitely should watch it. I think these videos are pretty engaging, so hopefully it's not too boring for you to have to do this. So I was just talking about how with my friend Olivia, I would presumably go into hanging out with her with certain schemas I hold about her and the situation, and how this in turn will affect my memory of the situation when later asked. So there is a whole thing of research about memory for schema consistent versus schema inconsistent information that you guys should really be thinking about. It's true that in some ways we are looking for information that is consistent with our schemas. But that said, if we receive information that is inconsistent, that might get encoded in our memory too because it would be seen as significant. So first, let's talk about this study that's discussed in your book as well, where participants were presented with a video of a woman who explained that she likes beer and classical music. She has diverse tastes. The participants who were told that this woman was a librarian were subsequently more likely to recall that she liked classical music. Those told she was a waitress were more likely to recall she liked beer. So what this is demonstrating then is that the type of schema that was primed about this woman informed what people remembered about her later. And so when people went into watching this video thinking she was a librarian, it makes sense to them that she likes nerdy things like classical music. On the other hand, when they had the schema activated that she was a waitress, which tends to be a more, lower socioeconomic status, more casual career, they were more likely to recall that she liked beer rather than that she liked classical music. So this is one demonstration then of how our schemas help us attend to information about a person. As I said, highly schema inconsistent information can be easily remembered as well. And that's because it often occurs to us as highly relevant or highly unusual. So one story I have about this is that I tend to come off as a pretty intellectual person. Obviously, I am a PhD student. Um, I like watching weird art films and referencing existential philosophy in everyday life, and people just tend to see me as very intellectual. And I had a colleague who was then really surprised when he found out that I kind of know some stuff about the Kardashian family. I don't know if I would say I'm a fan of them, but I am a little tuned into their lives. And just in general, I kind of like reality TV because I find it to be really funny. Um, After that, this colleague kind of constantly brought up Kim Kardashian to me. And so it was clear that he had had this schema of me as a very intellectual person, and then he was surprised to find that, I follow Kim Kardashian on Instagram. So this is just one example of how schema inconsistent information can be easily remembered and also easily recalled, right? Because not only did he recall it or remember it, but he was bringing it up a lot in conversation. If we were all together in person right now, I would be asking your guys' opinion on why it might be that highly schema inconsistent information gets easily remembered. Um, but we're not together, so I'll just tell you my thoughts on it, which is that we are motivated to understand the world and to have a sense of security in how we navigate it, right? And so this is why we do things like have our confirmation bias, but our ability to pick out new or significant information is something that's going to be highly adaptive to us surviving. So when we hear something that is schema inconsistent, there's a good chance that understanding this new information will help us navigate a new situation or help us navigate an existing situation even better, which will then improve our likelihood of surviving and reproducing. Imagine that you have a schema of someone or an impression that they are a very nice, sweet, reserved person. And then one day you see them blow up on someone, right? So that would be highly schema inconsistent. And during that time, you would probably be attending very closely to what set them off because in the future it would benefit you to make sure that they don't get angry at you, right? Then you can maintain your social connection to them. And so that's just one example of why attending to schema inconsistent information can really benefit us. The way that schema development and memory recall inform each other is really interesting. And one study that is detailed in your textbook looked at the effects of activating schema before or after listening to an audio tape of a woman recounting 36 different life events. So, this audio tape covered life events that were both positive and negative social behaviors on her part, like doing charity work, being critical of her boyfriend, etc. Everyone heard the same audio tape of the same 36 life events, but they were randomly assigned to conditions. So in the first condition, participants were randomly assigned to develop a schema of the woman on the audio tape before or after hearing the audio tape. So what this means is that they were given sort of a personality description of her prior to hearing the audio tape or after. The second condition was whether or not this was a positive or negative schema. So here what I had for you is a thing that's really common, particularly in social psychology, where you use a table to set up the levels of the independent variables and cross-reference them. So then you can either make predictions or show the results of these studies that tend to have more than one independent variable and multiple conditions. Right, so as you can see, condition one is across the top horizontally with schema before or after, and then condition two is on the left vertically with positive and negative schema. And this allows us to really organize the results from the study in a pretty simple way. And so what the results show here is that depending on whether the schema of this woman on the audio tape was presented before or after people listened to the audio tape, really affected what kind of information they eventually recalled about her. So people who heard the personality description of the woman and then heard the audio tape of her listing positive and negative life events were more likely to recall information that was inconsistent with the schema. So those who were told that she was like this great, nice, amazing person, and then heard the audio tape of her listing nice things she's done and bad things she's done, those participants then are more likely to recall negative behavior that she discussed doing, right? So they recall schema inconsistent behavior. On the flip side, people who were led to believe that she was a pretty bad person prior to hearing the audio tape recalled her more positive behaviors. Interestingly, when people were given the schema after hearing the audio tape, so it wasn't until after they heard the audio tape that they were told she was a good or a bad person, they were more likely to recall information that was consistent with the schema. So there's a little bit of a confirmation bias there, right? Where they're hearing this information that's both positive and negative, and then once they're told what kind of a person she is, right, they are more likely to recall information consistent with that schema because it occurred to them as more significant and relevant. Okay, now is a good time to take a break before we jump into the next section of the lecture. Welcome back. And now we're going to really get into the malleability of memory for a hot second. First, by talking about the misinformation effect. The misinformation effect is the process through which cues given after an event can plant false information into memory. I think this concept is pretty concerning for people, right? Like, we don't like to think that we somehow remember things that didn't actually happen, but a great deal of research done, especially in the 70s and the 80s, has really demonstrated that we can be cued to remember things that didn't actually happen. So one of the classic studies took participants and showed them a video of a car accident where one car hit another one. And participants were randomly assigned to be asked to estimate how fast the car was going when it smashed into the other car. Or they were assigned to estimate how fast the car was going when it hit the other car. The idea here was that using a term such as smashed would give a subtle cue of the violence and the intensity of the car accident, right? Smashed sounds a lot more violent than hit, right? And the results were confirmed, and what was found was that those who were asked to estimate how fast the car was going when it smashed into the other car versus when it hit the other car estimated that the car was going faster. You can see how this might have direct relevance to the real world. Imagine that you're a witness to a car accident, and then at the scene, the police officer or whoever is there taking statements asks you how fast is the car going when it smashed into the other car. You might be more likely to say it was going too fast versus if you were asked, the more direct question of how fast it was going when it hit the other car. There are plenty of sinister real life experiences of the misinformation effect, often leading to problematic or false accusations and charges in the legal system. Here in a second, you guys should watch a video that I have linked here in the PowerPoint by Elizabeth Loftus, who's the person who really pioneered this research, where she touches on several instances of this, but it's fairly well known that interrogations and interviews in the legal system are often subjected to the misinformation effect. And it happens in other areas too, including in clinical work, for psychotherapy, etc., or even among medical doctors. Something that can cause the misinformation effect is confirmation bias on someone else's side, right? So if I'm a police officer and you're someone who got mugged, I may really think that it was a person who looked homeless, right? And so through that, I might start asking you questions to confirm my bias. Rather than saying, what did he look like? I might say, did he look homeless, right? Or I might be more subtle than that and say, uh, did he look like he didn't have a lot of money? Did he look like he was living on the streets, maybe? Things along those lines. And if I keep up with that line of questioning enough, you might start to think, like, oh, well, maybe he did. Maybe his coat was a little dirty. Um, and so there's this sort of reciprocal pattern between a confirmation bias and a misinformation effect um, that is very important for you guys to know. Like I just said, I want you guys to watch this video. It's another TED Talk, just like the one from last lecture. Elizabeth Loftus describing her research, and it's very effective, and she covers quite a few concepts. And so watch this. There will probably be a question on the exam about it. It'll be really important. It's maybe about 20 minutes long, and I think our lecture will be a bit short today, so there shouldn't be any problem for you guys to watch it. Okay, and here I have another example of the misinformation effect for you guys of a more recent study that happened. And I just realized I don't have it cited here, but you can go to the blog linked and you can get the original citation there. So I like to show you guys more recent research studies on these classical findings because of the replication issues that I talked about in the last lecture or the lecture before that. The replication crisis, as I mentioned, involved a lot of classic foundational theories not replicating in new research studies, which was really unsettling. And so I like to bring up these more recent findings to show that these effects still are actually happening. And I thought this study was just so cool. Some of you might recall that in the last couple years there has been a push in Ireland to legalize abortion. This is, of course, as always, a very controversial topic, and it's something that has really dominated the news in and outside of Ireland for quite a long time. And so this research team decided to investigate the misinformation effect as it related to people thinking about the push to legalize abortion in Ireland. So in the study, participants were shown news stories concerning campaign events for and against legalizing abortion. So here we kind of refer to people as yes voters and no voters, or the yes campaign and the no campaign. And you can probably infer that yes people are those who support legalizing abortion, and no people are those who do not support it. Participants were shown these fake news stories that are detailed here on the right. So I took a screenshot from the original article of their stimuli and put it here. And so, for example, this first one shows a picture and says that the Together for Yes campaign had to destroy campaign posters after evidence emerged that the posters were bought using funding from American lobbyists. And I have to say that I really thought it was super funny that this research study in Ireland on politics made up fake news about American lobbyists. I think that kind of says something about how Americans are viewed abroad. So what's interesting is that half of the sample reported a false memory for at least one fabricated event. Over half believed that the event happened. A large proportion claimed they remembered an event happening, and still a significant proportion had a specific memory of seeing/hearing about the event. Anywhere from 10 to 30% of the sample reported a specific memory of seeing/hearing this event that was completely fake, right? So that is a direct demonstration of the misinformation effect, that they were told something happened and they said, oh yeah, I remember that. 10 to 30% is a wide range, and that's because the extent to which someone remembered a particular event depended on their personal beliefs, of course, right? And so what they found was that those who supported legalizing abortion were more likely to remember a fabricated scandal regarding the No campaign and vice versa. So here I have one of the graphs from this study for you guys to see, because I thought it might be a little bit easier with me referencing the results for you guys to have a visual for it. And of course, you guys can look up this article through the blog post I linked in the prior slide if you'd like. But anyways, I was just saying that anywhere from 10 to 30% of the sample uh, had a specific memory of seeing or hearing about one of these fake news events. So they basically remembered something that didn't happen. This 10 to 30% range depends on the personal political view of the participant, as well as whether or not the fake news that they were presented with was consistent or inconsistent with their views. So what we see here is that the highest number came from people who supported legalizing abortion, being presented with a fake news event of the No campaign doing something illegal. So it's quite interesting then, because when it came to illegal No campaign posters, uh, those who were yes supporters, right, were more likely to remember that event than those who were no supporters. And of course, the flip happens when it comes to illegal yes campaign posters. So people who were on the no campaign were more likely to remember a fake news event for the yes campaign to have been doing something illegal. But I do think it's worth noting that just no voters in general were more consistent, right? Like those are pretty similar. There's a much higher discrepancy between the yes voters across conditions versus the no voters. So the fact of the extent to which someone misremembered was much more effective and among yes voters, and a little bit more consistent among the no voters. But regardless, still a large percentage of people remembering an event that didn't happen. You can think about this happening in your everyday life, surely. We are in sort of an era of fake news, and so it is very easy for people to take in information that actually isn't correct and to go with it. I can't think of anyone I know who necessarily has constructed personal memories of fake news. Um, but associated with this is that people do believe fake news a lot, and they also believe it more when it confirms what they already believe. So I was just talking with a friend about some fake news that he fell for. You all have potentially seen a meme on the internet of like a younger Donald Trump, like maybe 40s or 50s. I think it was in the 90s. And you know, it's a picture of Donald Trump, and then it has this quote, and Donald Trump is allegedly saying something like, if he was to run for president, he would be a Republican because all Republicans are idiots, right? And so this meme has been shown a lot to sort of support and demonstrate the belief that Donald Trump isn't genuine, that he's just manipulative, and he's saying whatever he wants to say to get people to vote for him. And again, suggesting that Republicans are more susceptible to this than Democrats. The thing is that that quote isn't true. So if you believe it, you are a victim of fake news. Donald Trump never said that, at least not publicly. But for a lot of people, it confirms what they believe about him, it confirms their fears, and it makes sense given his personality. So people have shared it, just without fact checking. So that is an example of confirmation bias. We would be more likely to see the misinformation effect if someone claimed they remembered watching him say that on television, right? So hopefully that distinction is clear for you. And again, we can see how confirmation bias feeds into misinformation effect. So now in two different ways, I've told you about how confirmation bias for oneself or from another person can lead to the misinformation effect happening. And you should be familiar with both of those examples. Now that we've hit on misinformation effect quite a bit, we're going to move a little beyond that and start talking about other heuristics or effects that occur for people when it comes to taking in information from the world and making judgments based on that. So the first is the availability heuristic. This is the tendency to assume that information that comes easily to mind is more frequent or common. So, for example, I think the book uses this example that if you're asked to think of a country and the first thing that comes to mind is a terrorist attack there, you might be more likely to assume that terrorist attacks happen there a lot. A personal example I think I have of this is when I was getting ready to move to the Netherlands, my family was really nervous that I was going to get caught in some kind of domestic terrorist attack, or it wouldn't necessarily be domestic, but in some kind of attack where someone drives a car through a crowd of people, right? Because that was happening semi-regularly in Europe, right? There were quite a few instances of someone causing mass injuries and casualties through driving a car through a public space. It's ironic though, right? Because those kind of attacks happen because there's just less access to guns in those countries. Um, and even though those kind of attacks happen more often, they still happen a lot less than mass shootings in the United States. Right? So I always thought it was quite ironic that they were worried about me getting hit by a car in some terrorist attack when I live in a state that has had three really awful, horrific mass shootings in the last 20-ish years, right? So with that, I'm referencing Columbine, the Aurora Theater shooting, and Planned Parenthood. That said, though, my family had very little understanding of what Europe is like, and there was maybe a little bit of fear of me leaving America, which makes sense. And the first thing that came to mind for them were these terrorist attacks, and so they were quite worried that they were happening all the time over there and that I was going to get run over by a truck sometime. And that never happened, thankfully, although I did almost get hit by some angry Dutch people on bikes a few times. Very similar to the availability heuristic is the ease of retrieval effect. So this is the process whereby people judge how frequently an event occurs on the basis of how easily they can retrieve examples of that event. So there was a study, this is described in your text as well, where participants were randomly assigned to remember 6 or 12 times uh, that they were assertive. And those who were asked for a call 12 times actually rated themselves as less assertive. And that's because it's really hard to come up with 12 times that you were assertive. Um, so you kind of start to feel potentially like you're not very assertive because you can't reach that number, which is pretty interesting. So the availability heuristic and the ease of retrieval effect sound pretty similar. And the way to differentiate them is that the availability heuristic is really about what is most accessible, right? So when it comes to my family, they thought Europe, and the first thing they thought of with Europe was terrorist attacks involving cars, and therefore they assumed that they were pretty frequent and common. The ease of retrieval is really a lot more quantitative and incremental, right? So this is really about how um, the number of examples that are recalled then inform how they how frequently they judge that event happening. Another, I guess, weird personal example I have of this is that when I was a teenager, I was really into the TV show Glee, and I would listen to Glee covers of various songs. I wouldn't listen to all of them, but there were several covers that I really liked a lot and that I sometimes even felt like were better than the original. Please don't judge my taste. And I had a boyfriend at the time who pointed out that I thought every cover that Glee did was better than the original. And that's kind of an example of the ease of retrieval effect. Um, I would tell him anytime I thought a cover was better than the original, and he could think of several times I had done that, and so he started to assume that I thought that every Glee cover was better than the original, which was not true. I was only just telling him when I thought it was better, because why would you tell someone if you thought a cover was worse? Covers tend to be worse. So let me just reiterate one more time. Um, the availability heuristic versus ease of retrieval effect are two concepts that are really easy to mix up. So know that the availability heuristic is really just about what is most available at that time. Whereas ease of retrieval is a little bit more of a consideration process that takes into consideration the number of examples one can generate. So now let's move on to thinking about how we understand the world in terms of cause and effect. In 1958, the psychologist Heider introduced attribution theory to understand how others come to understand behavior of both themselves and the people around them. He coined the term causal attributions, which are explanations of an individual's behavior. And our causal attributions can really be understood on two different spectrums. So the first is the locus of causality, where attribution of the behavior is attributed either to some kind of internal aspect or an external aspect. So did the behavior happen because of something within the person who did the behavior, or can it be attributed to some cause of the situation around them? There's also stability, so attributing behavior to stable or unstable factors. So typically, right, if we're attributing something to an internal aspect, it tends to be stable, but not always. So if someone is acting angrily, right, we might say, well, they're an angry person, or we might say that something in the environment happened to make them angry. And when it comes to stability, we might say, again, they're an angry person, and so they just tend to react with anger to various situations. Or it might be unstable, right? Like they're not typically angry, but they've had a bad day, or they're sick, or someone just died in their life, right? And that would be considered an unstable factor. Along these lines, there are the concepts of a fixed versus incremental mindset. So a fixed mindset refers to this tendency to perceive traits or attributes as stable and unchangeable, whereas an incremental mindset refers to a tendency to perceive traits and attributes as being malleable over time. Your textbook talks about a very classic finding with Carol Dweck, I believe, or Dwyer, now I don't recall, a D name, about the role of fixed versus incremental mindsets in education and intelligence. And so it's helpful to think about how these mindsets can affect motivation, affect goal behavior, right? If you tend to have a fixed mindset about certain things, you're not likely to try to develop or grow in that area. What's interesting is that incremental versus fixed mindsets also affect judgment towards others. And so there was this really interesting study. It was a set of three studies actually, where participants were induced to think of a particular trait, such as empathy, aggression, or motivation, as incremental rather than fixed, right? So they were presented with information suggesting that people can grow in empathy or reduce aggression or improve their motivation, right? So half of the participants were randomly assigned to read something like that, and the other half were led to feel that empathy and aggression and motivation were these static traits, like you have it or you don't. What they found across three studies is that participants who were induced to think of a particular trait as incremental were more likely to rate that individual who was low in that trait as blameworthy. So if you believe that empathy is something that can be developed over time, and then you're presented with someone who's pretty unempathetic, you're likely to blame them for that lack of empathy they have. Whereas if you believe that empathy is just something you have or don't have, you can't really blame them, right? Because they don't have any control over this trait that they have. As we go through the next section, keep in mind dual process models of cognition. They're very important. And think about how these dual process models relate to causal attributions, right? A lot of our understanding of cause and effect happens automatically, right? We put something together immediately and sometimes without even thinking about it. Other times we deliberate for a really long period of time, especially if it's something that is really hurtful or confusing or annoying to us. So over the next several slides, we're going to talk about automatic processes and causal attributions, as well as more elaborated processes. So automatic causal attributions, you should know this already, they don't require elaborate consideration or reflection. That's sort of implied by them being automatic. They tend to be informed by two primary sources, personal experience and general cultural knowledge, right? So just like all of our other automatic associations, they come from repeated exposure that often takes less and less time to think about as we are continually exposed to these things that help us make these causal associations. One automatic causal process to understand is the correspondence inference. The term correspondence inference sounds very fancy and cognitive, but really what it refers to is the tendency to see someone do something, right? To enact an action and to consequently attribute some kind of internal attitude, desire, or trait to them because of that action. So, for example, you could take a look outside and see someone running, right? If you live here in Colorado, you'll probably see someone within 45 seconds. And so you see someone running, and you might be inclined to then assume that they are an athletic person, that they are committed to their health, that they like to run, but all of those internal attributes really aren't that well supported by one instance of someone running outside, right? You really don't know until you see them run multiple times a week, or maybe you talk to them. This is an example of the correspondence inference, and we do it quite a bit. That said, there are sort of three things that help facilitate the correspondence inference. So when these things are present, it's more likely one will make a correspondence inference about another person's actions. So for example, if an individual seems to have a choice in taking an action, whatever action they choose is going to be more likely to reflect on them versus if they didn't have a choice. So if you were asked if you would rather walk somewhere or bike somewhere and you chose to bike, people would be more likely to assume that you like biking versus if you only had the option to bike somewhere. The correspondence inference is more likely to be relied on when there is also only one salient difference between choices. So if someone, of course, has an option between a veggie pizza or a meat lovers pizza and chooses the meat lovers, you're more likely to assume that their choice of that pizza implies that they like meat or don't like vegetables. That said, if someone has a choice between a meat lover's pizza and some kind of pasta, you can't really infer whether or not they like meat because maybe they just don't like pizza, for example. Another thing that leads to the correspondence inference is a behavior that is inconsistent within the context of the situation. And that is really consistent with the idea of locus of causality, right? So if someone doesn't seem to be acting consistent with the situation, you can only assume that they're acting that way because of some internal attribute. So if, in pre-COVID times you were meeting someone for the first time and you went to shake their hand and they didn't shake your hand, that would be a bit inconsistent with the context of the situation, and you might be more likely to assume something about their personality because they didn't, uphold the social scripts of the situation. The correspondence inference really highlights this tendency, right, this desire on our part to attribute things to others that are internal about them. And this is consistent with the fundamental attribution error, which is the tendency to attribute behavior to internal or dispositional qualities of the actor and consequently undermine the causal role of situational factors, right? So we have a fundamental attribution error that leads us to want to attribute things to internal qualities, and our correspondence inferences help facilitate that. Building on the fundamental attribution error is the actor-observer effect. So this is the tendency to make internal attributions for the behaviors of others and external attributions for our own behavior. So whereas the fundamental attribution error really just talks about how we view others, the actor-observer effect gets at the contrast with how we view our own behavior versus others. This is very common for negative instances. So, for example, if you failed a test, you would probably be more likely to blame some kind of external factor, like you were really stressed out, or the professor was bad, um, you were distracted for some reason, there's a technology issue. Whereas if you heard that a friend failed the test, you might be more likely to say that they didn't study enough or that they're not very smart. On the other hand, if you ace a test, you're more likely to attribute it to your own intelligence. So along these lines, there was a study finding that in a sample of young drivers, participants tended to describe their friends as risky driving as something dispositional, right? As them acting cool or, being insane. But participants tended to describe their own driving as situational, their own risky driving as situational, such as being in a hurry. And I think as most of us slash all of us live in Colorado, we can all sort of relate to that. I know that when I'm on the road, especially I-25, I'm often thinking about how stupid people are. And then when I accidentally cut someone off, I'm like, oh, I made a mistake, right? And so you can see there how I'm attributing dispositional things to other drivers and, making it a little bit more situational on my part. I was distracted. This was just an unstable thing that happened. I'm definitely not a bad driver. The actor-observer effect also relates to intimate and interpersonal situations. It's interestingly been applied quite a bit to infidelity in romantic relationships. And so this one study found that participants were likely to judge their partner's infidelity as being related to internal and stable causes, more so than they judge their own infidelity as being related to internal unstable causes. Right, so we typically have the perspective that, like, once a cheater, always a cheater. Uh, but most of the time when people cheat, they talk about being stressed out or that the relationship wasn't good, right? Like they talk about situational factors. Interestingly, in this study, attributions affected the extent to which a partner's hypothetical behavior was judged as infidelity. So, if a partner's hypothetical behavior was sort of associated with, less internal attributions, then it was less likely to be seen as infidelity, which is pretty interesting. So let's loop back around to the fundamental attribution error and talk about how it relates to different cultures. So in our second week's lecture, we talked about individualistic versus collectivistic cultures and how they differ in a lot of ways and have implications for different social processes. Right, so specifically, individualistic cultures really put a lot of emphasis on individual meaning and self-worth, and subsequently judgment and responsibility. Whereas collectivistic cultures, because they so often emphasize, right, the society over the individual, might be more open to acknowledging the role of situational factors in attributional situations. Right, and so there's research to support this, that people from collectivistic cultures tend to emphasize external actors or factors in describing behavior more so than people from individualistic cultures. Similarly, um, there are variations even within individualistic cultures. So in a sample of US Americans, people of lower socioeconomic status versus higher tend to commit the fundamental attribution error less frequently. So that is, they're less likely to attribute things to the individual's internal and stable traits versus external traits outside of the individual. This is consistent with low socioeconomic status being associated with an external locus of control. So people of lower SES tend to view the world as less controllable, often because they have less control over the world, right? So people with low SES tend to have fewer opportunities, tend to be subjected to the help of other people. And so because of that, they are more likely to attribute behaviors to situational context than intrapersonal context. Okay, so go ahead and take another break if you'd like, and then come back for the next section of the lecture. Okay, hello, welcome back. We are going to continue talking about attributions for a good portion of the lecture before moving on to impression formation. So let's talk a bit about dispositional attribution. So the extent to which we make a dispositional inference about a person. There are 3 steps to this outlined in your book. First is that a behavior is observed and labeled. And then there typically is an automatic corresponding dispositional inference. But then typically attributions are modified to take situational factors into account. However, it's worth noting that we can really only take situational factors into account if we have the time or the cognitive capacity to, right? And that gets back to the dual process model perspective on this. Our automatic causal attributions don't take very much time. They're easily accessible. And if we want to expand on our causal attributions or dispositional attributions, it might require time and energy that we don't necessarily have. So let's dive into that a little deeper. I was just saying that cognitive resources are needed to understand and modify dispositional attributions. So there's a study described in your textbook, and I have the figure here, figure 4.6. And basically, participants were shown a videotape of a woman who looked a bit nervous, and she was discussing various topics, but the video was silent. Participants were then shown whether she was talking about anxiety-provoking topics or relaxing topics, such as vacations, travel, etc. So, under normal conditions, people were more likely to change their judgment of this woman, right? So initially she looks anxious, but upon seeing that she is talking about anxiety-provoking topics, they are less likely to judge her as anxious due to the situation. However, people who are under cognitive strain or under cognitive load didn't change their perceived anxiety of the model, presumably because they didn't have the resources to really consider the situational and contextual nature of the situation. Along those lines, motivations also affect the dispositional attribution process. So one study by Linda Skitka in 2002 found that in general, conservatives tend to view people with AIDS as more irresponsible than liberals, right? So basically, conservatives are more likely to see people who have AIDS as being responsible for their condition, whereas liberals maybe put less blame on people with AIDS. However, when liberals are under cognitive load or cognitive strain, they tend to view AIDS patients as irresponsible as conservatives do. So this suggests then that liberals are motivated to be less judgmental towards people. However, when they don't have the cognitive resources to enact that motivation, they will fall on the same information and the same judgments as conservatives will. So then discussing how people can change their initial interpretations or attributions of behavior leads us then to start discussing elaborate attributional processes. So within a dual process model perspective, right, these are the controlled processes that stem from the cognitive system when it comes to judging attributions. So when we have more cognitive resources, more time, and the motivation, we can put a lot of effort into understanding what causes other people's behavior. And so we will use causal hypothesis testing to understand these causal attributions. Even though we can spend more time gathering evidence to understand behavior, we are still highly influenced by salient schemas and other considerations, right? So we still have our basic understandings of human behavior that we will try to fit external information to. One of the other things we're subjected to is the covariation principle. This is the tendency to see a causal relationship between an event and an outcome when they happen at the same time. The covariation principle is what leads to people mistaking correlation for causation. Right? So we see things happening at the same time and we're inclined to assume that they're connected or even cause one another, but that's actually not true. So there are things that direct us, right, towards attributing something to external versus internal causes. And the covariation model was introduced to help us understand how behavior is more likely to be attributed to an external cause. This is important because we've been talking about how there are all these motivations and tendencies to attribute another person's behavior to internal stable causes. And so the covariation model sort of distinguishes when we might be more likely to attribute someone else's behavior to something external. According to this model, consistency, consensus, and distinctiveness are all relevant to determining whether something is attributed to internal versus external causes. So the first is consensus. So if a behavior happens a lot among someone's social group, it's more likely to be attributed to an external cause than an internal cause. Cause, not clause, sorry. So for example, imagine someone who likes to hold the door open for other people when entering like a business establishment. If not a lot of people do this, this might be reflected on the person as them being very polite. Whereas if people frequently do it, it's not necessarily them being polite, it's just something that people are expected to do. The second thing is distinctiveness. So when someone's behavior emerges as highly distinctive in the context of their personality, it's more likely to be attributed to an external cause, right? Something is causing it to happen and causing them to act or behave in a way that's inconsistent with their personality. The third is consistency. If something only happens once, then it's more likely to be attributed to something that happened at the same time that one thing was happening. Whereas if it happens consistently, then you might be more likely to attribute it to some kind of stable attribute, external or internal. Your book uses an example of a woman named Reese who is talking about a movie she loved. And I think that's a really good example that you guys should read over for sure. Among these lines is the concept of the discounting principle. So when we're trying to understand causal factors, things can get a bit messy because really in any given situation, there are a million things affecting the cause and effect of the situation. So what has been found is that the presence of other potential causes for a given behavior influence the amount that we assign a given causal effect to a given behavior. In these situations, the discounting principle can come into play. This is the tendency to downplay other potential causes of one's behavior when a particular cause is salient. So your book talks about athletes who have relied on performance-enhancing drugs to succeed, right? These people typically are objectively successful and talented. But when we find out that they've been using performance enhancing drugs, sometimes people want to discount their talent and ability and attribute all of their success to the performance enhancing drugs. So everything we've talked about so far today should make it clear that our causal attributions are often influenced by biased information. We come into any given situation with any number of desires, expectations, and schemas, right? So we have hopes for the situation, we have expectations for how it should play out. Along those lines, our lay epistemics come into play too, our need for accuracy, confirmation, and closure. All of these motivations then lead us to not necessarily make the most accurate attributions, but rather the ones that make the most sense or that meet our needs. Along those lines, then it should make sense that we are typically motivated to attribute people's behaviors to stable traits so we can feel that we'll be able to predict their behavior, right? So if we want to say that someone's behavior is due to their environment, then that means that we really don't understand that person very well at all, and we're not sure how to interact with them in a way that keeps us safe and happy. As humans, right, as existing beings, we are motivated to have strong social connections, to maintain a safe social group, and to keep away from harm. It's difficult for us to do that if we don't really understand the people around us or the traits that they have. This leads us then to thinking about how we form impressions of others. We are clearly motivated to feel that we understand others, and there is an evolutionary benefit to this. As we talked about in the second week of class, humans have developed a number of abilities to help them connect with others and maintain those connections. Right, so first we already know that humans have a uniquely developed ability to recognize others' faces through the fusiform face area, which is a brain structure that aids in recognizing and reading facial expressions. Our ability to recognize faces and read their expressions aids in our ability to distinguish enemies, potential mates, and close relatives. It also helps us avoid sickness when we can see disgust and pain on someone's face. We can potentially avoid them to make sure that we don't get infected or hurt either. This is related to the development of mirror neurons in humans. These are neurons that are activated both when one performs an action as well as when one observes another person perform that action. So these neurons help us understand how others are feeling so we can better connect with them. Another concept that really plays heavily into our ability to form impressions and connect with others is theory of mind. Theory of mind is this broad set of ideas that we have about others' thoughts, desires, feelings, and intentions based on what we know about them and the situations that they're in. Right? This allows us to empathize with others. It allows us to predict their behavior. It facilitates social connections and social situations. Certain disorders, including autism spectrum disorder, involved impaired theory of mind. So this is, you know, very common with people who are on the autism spectrum, but others as well, that some people just seem to have impairments in their ability to read the expressions of other people and to put themselves in their shoes and to consider what they do or don't know. Theory of mind often emerges pretty young in children, maybe around ages 3 or 4, where they start um, to think about what others may or may not know in a situation. So prior to that, people tend, like children, for example, tend to um, project their own knowledge onto other people. They assume that others know what they know. And then at a certain point, they develop the ability to realize that they have a unique understanding of themselves, and that every human does, and that it's important to put yourself in other people's shoes to connect with them. The sort of classic theory of mind um, test is kind of similar to this picture I have here on the right. So you would show this to someone and have them read through it, right? This is Sally, this is Anne. Sally has a ball, she puts it in her basket. Sally goes for a walk and takes the ball and puts it in a box. Sally comes back. Where is she going to look for the ball? Someone with poor theory of mind would say she's going to look in the box, excuse me. Because they know the ball is in the box and they assume Sally should know too, right? But if you have good theory of mind, you realize that Sally is going to look in the basket and she's going to have no idea that the ball is in the box. Theory of mind is just another thing that we have developed to help us navigate the social world and to ultimately maintain safety and security. So we have two different approaches for forming impressions of other people. And again, don't forget that impressions are the types of scripts that we have for specific people. You may have heard the terms bottom up and top down before. They typically refer to the way we process or develop information about things. A bottom-up approach is more focused on gathering information and using that to form a more abstract judgment, where a top-down approach, you start with your sort of abstract understandings and form ideas from there. So when it comes up to a bottom-up approach to impression formation, this really just refers to gathering individual observations to form an overall impression of someone. And it can be highly adaptive. We have really developed all these evolved skills for understanding others. So it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that in relatively short amounts of time, we can judge personality pretty quickly. This is referred to as thin slices. So in a thin slice of time, humans are able to accurately judge personality. One interesting study along these lines is that impressions based on social media profiles are consistent with self-reports of personality. So what they did in the study is they found people, had them judge their own personalities, had a close person judge their personalities, and then they showed their social media profiles to people who didn't know them. And what they found is that those judgments of the social media profiles were very consistent with how people judge themselves and how people's close others judge them. I actually found this pretty validating because I have often judged people for their social media presence, and sometimes feel quite guilty about it. But this implies that there is something fair and adaptive at play when we do that. There's also top-down processes for impression formation. So this refers to forming an impression based on preconceived ideas. We have our general beliefs about people, especially different kinds of people, and it's likely that we will sort of demonstrate a bit of a confirmation bias when we meet people and want to form impressions of them. I think I have talked about my boyfriend before in this class, and maybe after my first or second date with him, I found out that he had made an album, like of music. And at that point in my life, I had met a lot of men my age who thought that playing music made them really special, and like they bragged kind of about it. Like I could really get the sense that uh, usually when I went on a date with a musician, that they wanted me to be impressed with them being a musician. So when my current boyfriend mentioned that he made an album, I didn't respond to it because I was just like, oh, he's just trying to like impress me, and I don't care about that. And then I later found that he was not really trying to impress me at all, and he had just mentioned it casually. So this is an example on how I had a preconceived idea about what it meant for someone to bring up that they were a musician, and it was wrong. I had stereotyped my boyfriend, and thankfully we made it past that, um, and that I didn't judge him too harshly for it. So another way that top-down impression formation happens is through false consensus. So we assume others to be similar to ourselves. And this might be because our own attitudes and preferences are especially accessible, right? And our attitudes and preferences make so much sense to us. I have an example here, like I've mentioned to you guys in this lecture that I watched some reality TV. And there's a a bachelorette from a couple of years ago. Her name is Becca Kufrin. And she got engaged to a guy named Garrett from the show. And then it came out that he had liked some somewhat unsavory social media posts. Some social media posts that weren't just, you know, political, but they were quite rude about gun violence and transgender individuals, and there was a big backlash to it. And this has actually surprisingly been a drama that's gone on for a couple years, and they just broke up because of political differences. And what information has come out is that Becca Kufrin, the Bachelorette, is pretty left leaning. She posts about feminism a lot. I think she was a Bernie supporter. And it seemed that she just assumed that everyone else that she would be dating would be a liberal too. It seemed really hard for her to understand that others might be Trump supporters or be so right leaning to the point that she got engaged to someone who she actually disagreed with on a lot of fundamental levels. So I'm not trying to make a political comment here, but more just talk about how we often assume that others hold our same political views as well as our other attitudes and preferences. Um, we especially assume this if, we like them or we want to like them. But it is, as the term suggests, a false consensus. Along those lines, we have the halo effect, which is the tendency to judge an individual on a given trait, and that being influenced by more general impressions of the individual. The halo effect has been studied quite a bit in politicians and also quite a bit in attractiveness research. So, attractive people tend to be judged as generally positive on other traits. But there's one study found that when an attractive woman was presented with neutral or positive personality information, there was a halo effect. But if she was presented with negative personality descriptions, that reduced the halo effect. So the halo effect is not completely pervasive. It can be reduced in certain situations, particularly if there is salient negative information. But if there isn't any salient negative information, then we are likely to take something positive about someone and expand upon that. Another study found that positive affect inductions increase halo effects. And that actually makes quite a bit of sense based on a prior study we talked about, right? Do you guys remember that study I talked about where inducing positive affect in women led them to decrease judgments of discrimination um, for themselves and for women in general? Right? And so what we find is that when people are feeling good in the moment, they tend to see things as more positive out in the world. And so that extends to having a halo effect when it comes to the judgment of other people. So in the past, we have already touched on stereotyping, but I wanted to come back to it because we are talking about the formation of impressions. And stereotyping happens a lot in how we form impressions of other people. So, as you probably recall, stereotyping is a cognitive shortcut that involves applying a schema of a type of person to judge an individual. I probably don't have to remind you that this can be problematic because our schemas are often informed by biased and limited and personal information. Related to stereotyping is the representativeness heuristic, which is a tendency to overestimate the likelihood that a person is part of a larger category if the person has features that seem representative of that category. So, for example, if I told you that Jessica loves guns, you might assume that Jessica is a Republican. However, you don't know that for sure, right? It's just based on the stereotype that Republicans love guns. It could be that Jessica is a libertarian or even a liberal who loves guns. There's a whole subreddit on Reddit for liberal gun owners. Fun fact. The flip side of stereotyping is individuation. This is the process of creating an impression of a person that is accurate and not influenced by stereotypes. So individuation is obviously effortful. It requires gathering a lot of information about a particular person. Considering motivations for stereotyping and individuation, you should really think to your lay epistemics, right? So our need for accuracy, our need to confirm, and our need for closure. Individuals who have need for closure or need to confirm are going to be more likely to stereotype, although for different reasons, right? So people who have a high need for closure are going to stereotype because stereotyping provides a clean impression of someone in a very quick manner. Individuals with a need to confirm are going to stereotype because it confirms their already existing schemas of people. Individuals with the need for accuracy are going to be less likely to stereotype. They probably still will stereotype because, again, it is a cognitive shortcut that's really helpful. But those with the need for accuracy are going to be more likely to engage in individuation. We are also motivated to engage in individuation when we are motivated to really get to know someone well. So let's say that you think all blondes are stupid and you don't like stupid people, so you don't really talk to blonde people. And then let's say that your sister brings home a blonde boyfriend. You will probably be motivated to override that stereotype and get to know him well because you care about her and you care about her relationship. Um, the motivation to individuate under certain circumstances, I think, is relevant when thinking about people who say that they're not racist because they have a black friend, right? So it's likely that that person's relationship with that person of color is individuated, right? They've gotten to know that person as a person, not just as that person's race. That said, even if you have an individuated relationship with someone, you can still stereotype and have prejudices. So this is our last section before we get into a brief exam review. Um, I just want to touch on counterfactual thinking. Counterfactuals are alternatives that run counter to what actually happened. Um, Intuitively, right, we can have sort of positive and negative counterfactuals, or as they're often referred to, upward and downward counterfactuals. Upward counterfactuals involve imagining an outcome that was better than what actually happened. Upward counterfactuals can make us feel worse, but they provide us with the ability to prepare for the future, and they're best applied when we have control. So if you do poorly on an exam, an upward counterfactual can be really motivating to do better on your next exam. Downward counterfactuals include imagining an alternative in which the outcome is worse than what actually happened. This is better applied when we do not have control for the future. Of course, if we think we might run into the same situation in the future, thinking about how the outcome could be worse might be harmful for us. So considering downward counterfactuals is really only helpful when it's something that we've already experienced and it potentially helps us move on from it. We have a lot of motivations for counterfactual thinking. Mentally simulating possible futures helps us plan for how to respond. It increases perceptions of control and likely improves future outcomes. So when we consider what the future might hold and prepare for it, we will be better prepared for if it actually happens. When you have to have a difficult conversation with a friend or a partner, parent, teacher, it's probably helpful for you to consider all of the possible ways that conversation could go so that way you don't freeze up in the moment. Counterfactual thinking also enables us to learn from bad things that have happened. So when something goes poorly, we can reflect on that and think about what we might change in the future. For fun, you can watch this very short clip of Jerry Seinfeld talking about Olympic athletes and counterfactuals. This example is also used in your textbook. It's like a minute or two long. It's just for fun. You don't have to watch it if you don't want to, but I think it's kind of funny and engaging. Okay, so this lecture came out to about 2 hours, if you include the videos that you are required to watch. And so now we are going to move on to just a brief review for the exam next week. There is a lot of material for you guys to cover. Um, And so I'll just briefly touch on the things that are important. Okay, so the first exam is going to be just multiple choice questions. It'll happen online through Canvas, covering chapters 1 through 4. It is open book because you guys are at home and I'm not like trying to force you to be super stringent. Like it's open book. Because of that, the exam will be shorter and it will be timed. So don't think that you can just flip through the book as you're taking the exam. You do need to prepare for it, but you can use the book as a resource while you're taking the exam. I will not be doing anything to like monitor you guys. I think it's sort of an invasion of privacy to put yourselves on video, and I won't be doing like the lockdown browser or anything like that. It's fine. So you need to understand your textbook chapters, obviously no lecture, the videos that I link and other links that I've mentioned that are important. Not all of the links that I've shown you are required, but I usually say in the lecture whether or not they are. And if you have any questions about a specific video or article, you can email me. Yeah, so when it comes to research studies, know the basic findings and know how it relates to a given concept or theory. So for example, I use terror management theory quite a bit. I think in the last lecture I used objectification theory to talk about the effect of culture on schema development. So like that's something you should know, that I discussed objectification theory research as it related to the effects of culture on schema development. I want you to know how broad concepts, well, one, just know broad concepts, but also how they relate to each other. So throughout the course of this class so far, I often reference things from past lectures because I want you to be mentally connecting them together. So think about the core assumptions of social psychology and how that relates to the other things we've discussed so far and in class, right? And so, for example, one of the core assumptions of social psychology is the role that social cognition plays in behavior, right? And both lectures 3 and 4 were really expansions on that idea. Understand the scientific method and understand limitations of science and evaluating research, right? So these are all list of things that I've created for you guys, and I typically provide examples for them. And so I have a good understanding of all of those. I would say anything that is a list should be considered. When I was a student, if something was a list, I would make sure to definitely study it. And so I'll just give that advice on to you guys. Understand how data and theory inform one another. Understand the domain general adaptations of humans and how this has contributed to our current social behavior. Understand the section on culture and what it provides for general functioning, but also how culture has popped up for the development of social cognition, right? So I was just saying that culture is important for schema development. So make note of all the times that I really discuss the role of culture and how it contextualizes our everyday behavior and understanding of the world. I want you guys to also understand motivational factors in social cognition, and so I am in part referencing affective motivation, right, and our fundamental motives towards security and growth. But I also really want to highlight the theory of lay epistemics um, and how that relates to other concepts and findings in social psychology. So especially throughout this lecture and the lecture before, I reference how different lay epistemics relate to different findings. So definitely review those and be thinking about how need for accuracy versus need for closure versus need for confirmation all play in to the other things you've learned so far in this class. Also have a good understanding of how schemas and associative networks work. The social cognition is very important to the understanding of social psychology, not just for this section, but completely moving forward. It's likely that I will reference the things we talked about in lecture 3 throughout the entirety of this course. And so make sure you have just a good working understanding of what those concepts mean. Right, so earlier in this lecture, we talked about schema consistent and schema inconsistent information and memory. That's a good study to have a good understanding of, and a good example of how I want to have you guys understand how these basics of social cognition relate to other processes. I have touched on dual process theories of cognition a lot. I touched on this in a lecture even before your book talked about dual process theories of cognition. So really have a good understanding of automatic versus controlled processes, of the experiential system versus the cognitive system, and what this means for other things we've learned about, like attribution theory. Know the basics of the replication crisis, just the things I talked about on the slide, and really think about how it relates to evaluating research, right? So, in our discussion on social priming, I brought back up the evaluating research slide, and we talked about what this means for the replication crisis. So just be familiar about how those things relate to one another. I've already talked about this, but be aware of how schemas influence memories and attributions. Be very familiar with the misinformation effect. I think this is a very important concept in social psychology, and so there will certainly be questions about it, and make sure to watch the Elizabeth Loftus TED Talk. Uh, Finally, I have a good understanding of how impressions are formed. So I didn't want to go into a really long review here because if I did that, I'd be basically giving you guys the answers to the exam. The exam really shouldn't be that challenging. It's really important for you guys to take away important things from this class. And so I really don't plan on trying to trick you or make you know obscure details, but feel like you could explain all of these concepts to someone else, right? Not necessarily in the same way I do it or how a tenured psychologist would, right? But I would suggest go into studying imagining that you kind of want to tell a friend about an interesting thing that you learned in social psychology class, and applying that perspective for how you study for the exam. And if you're able to have sort of that kind of working understanding of it, I think the exam will go fine. So the exam will be posted next week sometime, Wednesday night or Thursday morning. I'm not exactly sure what I say in the syllabus, but it'll be posted then, and then you guys will have throughout the weekend to do it. So it'll be due next Sunday at midnight. And when I say next Sunday, let me look at my calendar. When I say next Sunday, I mean Sunday the 27th. So it'll be open from Thursday the 24th at 8 a.m. at the very least to Sunday the 27th at midnight. If you are going to have any issues with that, you need to talk to me beforehand. I'm going to be a lot grumpier if you wait until after the exam to talk to me. Anyone with any kind of accommodations that are needed, please contact me and we will work it out. Okay, so I have office hours Thursday 11 to 1 and Mondays 2 to 4. There's a good chance I will do office hours on Wednesday as well to help you guys prepare for the exam. Please email me with any questions or concerns. And good luck in your studying and preparation. Have a good week.